Welcome back, everyone, to Progressively Incorrect. I am so excited today to be speaking with Kim Lockhart. We're going to be watching some video and talking about her work, and she's a huge influence on me on X and social media. Before we jump on over to Kim, just wanted to remind everybody that this podcast is sponsored by John Catt Educational, which publishes some of the best books in education, including my new book, which I will continue to promote on this show until someone other than my mom buys it. My new book is Just Tell Them the Science. It was called something else, but it is now called Just Tell Them the Power of Explanations and Explicit Teaching. I will put in links to John Catt's whole catalog and to my book in the show notes, so please go and check that out. And that's enough about the sponsorship. Let's talk to Kim. Kim, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
It's wonderful to have you on because folks who are in the Twitter sphere, they have seen some of your phonics videos and science of reading videos, and I have shared them with people. What you do and kind of introduce yourself.
Okay, so with regards to the videos, I'll be honest, as a classroom teacher and also a special education teacher where I work with students who struggle to read and write, I work with them in small groups. I felt like there was this missing piece in education, and that was not just telling teachers what they have to teach or telling them why they have to teach it because the research says blah, 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 but showing them how. We are not exposed to the how piece. And so having been educated here in Ontario, Canada, I went to university and I was always told what I had to teach. Sometimes, if I was lucky, the research, whether or not it aligned with the reading research that I now know. But one thing I was never shown, like millions of other teachers across the world, was what does this look like in the classroom? So after I did my Orton Gillingham training, for me, that was the real aha. This is what it looks like. So the reason I started posting to Twitter X was because I felt like teachers needed to see how and what it looks like in classroom practice, but also in small groups. So that's what inspired me to do that.
I love it. And I love the line like I think it's a Doug Lemov thing, but it's just like the video doesn't lie. It's like it's this, we can talk about high expectations or we can talk about breaking it down into small pieces or gathering responses from everyone. All the explicit instruction pieces, but until you see it from like I would consider you a master teacher in looking at this video, until you see like a master teacher really breaking it down, you don't realize how granular steps can really become.
Absolutely. And also, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second, but also how messy it can be. Because I think sometimes when we open beautiful books with the best intention, we see students who can do it. But what we don't see is the instruction that preceded the child's ability to be able to do that effectively. So regardless of what teacher book that I pick up, it's usually a child who's proficient at that skill. And so teachers are left thinking, well, what do I do to get my child to be that ideal picture in the book? So it's what does the instruction look like? Because I think in education, there's been so much focus on the activities and what the kids are doing, but the kids can't do it until they've had the instruction. So it's really been this mindset shift that at the end of the day, it's the instruction that matters the most. And the magic is in the instruction and the kids. And I know I think it's on my Twitter post, but it's how well they learn depends on how well you teach it. And we want to avoid backpedaling. So the better and the more explicitly I teach something, usually the better the student outcomes are.
I love that. And I think we sometimes, in our frustration with loads of things, right? Workload and behavior and bureaucracy, we end up, I think, passing the blame on to the students implicitly, unintentionally, right? When if the main guiding philosophy of every teacher is like, if I like the buck stops with me, like if they didn't learn, it's because I didn't teach it that well. If everybody just adopted that main heuristic or framework for their teaching, I honestly think that's a great start in a lot of ways.
Oh, 100%. And I think it really is, again, this mindset shift. And it's taken me a very long time to get where I am today. But if there's this mindset that if we give the kids the answers, we're cheating them. But that's explicit instruction. We want to give them the answers. They can't figure out their way there if they don't have a pathway to get there. So that explicit instruction piece, I think, can often be misunderstood. And I have been a learner in many different capacities. And one thing that I've learned as a student and a learner myself is the more explicit the instruction, the clearer the expectations are, and the more likely I am going to be able to achieve those expectations. But if the teacher is not explicit, then there's a lot of guessing. And we know that guessing doesn't always arrive at the best learning outcomes. And so that explicit instruction, it is not cheating the child. It is not giving them the answers. They need to know exactly how to get there so that they can be successful.
I love it. What I think we should do now is watch a video clip of you teaching. I haven't seen one in a little bit, but when they come up, I always bookmark them. I always like, and sometimes I'll stand and do it. I'm a nerd of this thing, so sometimes I'll like do the same thing, to the mirror, kind of like practice doing it. I know just enough French to be able to do that with this content. Let's watch the video, and as I cue it up, do you want to maybe kind of preview the audience who cannot see what's happening, kind of what they're going to be listening to?
Absolutely. So a few days a week, I am in a kindergarten French immersion classroom. So here in Ontario, many schools, not all French immersion schools, but many French immersion schools start French immersion in junior kindergarten. So the students are as young as 3 sometimes when they come in September. And this is a 2-year intensive French immersion program. So I am sitting in front of a class of, I think there were 25, maybe 26 kids there that day, ranging from age 3 to age 5. And I have already taught them some of the letter sound correspondences in French. And so I am modeling how to articulate those speech sounds, how to identify those sounds when they see the letter, how to blend letters together to read syllables. So again, I am explicitly showing and telling them the letter sound correspondences because I want them to repeat after me and eventually be able to do it independently. So it is that explicit, systematic approach that uses the Anita Archer's I do, we do, you do model. And I think that is part of the reason why this video, as messy as it is, because they're real live children, they're not little robots, but I think we need to make sure that teachers understand that this is an I do, we do, you do approach to develop students' independence to doing it on their own.
Perfect. Okay, let's take a look.
Tout le monde répète. U. U. Montre-moi ta bouche. U. Excellent. Stop. Écoute. B. U. Bu. Vas-y. Écoute. B. U. Bu. Vas-y. Yeah. Écoute. D. U. Du. Vas-y. U. Fu. Vas-y. Écoute. J. U. Ju. Vas-y. Écoute. L. U. Lu. Vas-y. Montre-moi le son. Écoute. Écoute. M. U. Mu. Vas-y. Écoute. N. U. Nu. Vas-y. Écoute. P. U. Pu. S. U. Su. Vas-y. Écoute. T. U. Tu. Vas-y. Écoute. V. U. Nu. Vas-y. Qui peut lire les syllabes toutes seules?
Odin, come back. You are making
Est-ce que
so
tu peux
people cannot see. Turn around. Turn around the other way.
Excellent. Excellent. Bravo. Bravo. Excellent. Qu'est-ce que c'est le son? Fais-le encore. Bravo. Excellent. Et finalement, raise, raise the bravo! Excellent.
Oh my gosh, that
Wow.
was so cringy. It was. It really
No,
was.
not to us, but I know, I think a lot of times to show a video like that is to be very vulnerable. And even though you've shown this to millions of people, you still feel that. I don't feel that feeling listening to it, you know?
Well, that's nice of you, but I look at my hair and I think, oh yes, I did not spend much time on my hair that day, but that's okay. But people couldn't see though, because they were listening, is I'm doing some actions as well. So when we read pu, I plugged my nose because that means in French, ooh, that stinks, ça pue, that stinks. So it really is helping students not just decode those syllables, but for some of them, they are actually real words. So connecting meaning too, because we need for our French immersion, our second language learners, they may be decoding, but we need to also link the what does that mean and attach meaning to those words they're reading as well.
Love it. And I noticed a few things. If you'll give me a chance to do some live coaching,
Please do.
I noticed the first thing is that everybody is responding at first, and then
Yes.
you go to individual turns.
Correct.
And I think that overt response of high ratio, 30 kids responding to we can do individuals, or we can do the back of the room and the side of the room. We can do smaller sets of students and then finally go down to the individual level. Super important. I thought you did that sequence beautifully.
And with that, everyone does everything. That's another archerism. Everyone's doing everything. So when someone said mu, I could correct, but I didn't point out that one child. I said, oh, let's try that sound again. It's it's a stretchy, continuous sound. Nobody knows who said "m" because they were all reading together, but it's that immediate correction. So when we did it a second time, I don't know if you noticed or not, but they went mu, and that is actually not a word in French, but it is a syllable. So when they read a multisyllabic word like museau, which means a dog's muzzle or an animal's muzzle, it's part of a word. So that automatic correction to the whole class, I think is a very important piece of this as well.
Absolutely. And people give cold calling like a bad name, but this is the thing. There's like 20 ways to fix all of the fair criticisms of some bad uses of techniques. Like you just said, kid gets the answer incorrect. We can't allow them to perhaps embed a misconception, but we can have the whole class correct without facing the child and pointing at them and saying that is wrong, I cannot believe you, or doing a gotcha to someone else. And you can just simply get everyone to respond. Doing that enough creates that culture of error where it's okay to make mistakes, right?
Exactly. And so I do like that whole class instruction because you can hear everybody saying it together, and kids aren't being centered out if somebody happens to say the pronounce or articulate the sound incorrectly.
Love it. And I think and we'll talk about this now, talking about second language learning, but so much of how we teach foreign language, second language in especially like in secondary, where the kids never talk, never say the words, and of course they're embarrassed to use the language after that. But this way, you're getting everyone to play with the language, for lack of a better word, to say it, to revoice it, for it to become them, by getting everyone to do it chorally.
Absolutely. And that for me has been a huge learning curve over, I would say, the last 2 years, is really building students receptive language, that is what they hear, and increasing the output of expressive language, which is their ability to repeat and to use the language that is in their receptive language. But if we think about natural human development, babies and toddlers are often learning to understand spoken language before they're able to use spoken language. So how many times does a child have to hear mama or dada or cat? That was my daughter's first word, cat, before it is in their expressive vocabulary. So one of the other reasons why I use this I do, we do, you do approach is because it increases students' opportunities to practice that expressive language. So I'm building their receptive language when I'm saying it, but then I'm building their expressive language when I give them opportunities to use those vocabulary words as well.
Love it. I think this goes right into our question, which our first question I have for you, which is this podcast is very friendly to the science of reading, and it seems like every other episode we talk about it. How can the science of reading be effectively applied to support second language L2 learners in the classroom?
Okay, so that's a great question. And so I often refer people to the Science of Reading Defining Guide that was released by the Reading League. And they really emphasize how all of the elements of a structured literacy approach, which is phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, building content and background knowledge, and reading comprehension, as well as written expression, are essential for our second and multilingual learners. However, we need, as second language educators and educators of multilingual learners, to have a particular emphasis on oral language. And that is because many of our multilingual and additional language students who are coming into the classroom do not have that foundation because they're speaking a different language at home. For example, if I taught in English and my students lived primarily in English-speaking homes, when they come to school and I say, line up at the door, they understand what I'm saying. Whether or not they can do it, that's a whole other question, but they understand what a line is. They understand what the door is. They may go to that general area. However, my second language learners, when I say, okay, mes amis, vas-y à la porte, that is not in their receptive language. They don't understand those vocabulary words. They don't understand what I'm asking them to do. So we need to build that oral language base. And I often think about Margie Gillis's structured literacy wheel of reading. And around the wheel, on the outside of the wheel, she has the components of a structured literacy approach, but at the center of that wheel is oral language. And I often think of it as being like one of those Velcro tennis mitts. I had them in the 80s, and we had these two Velcro mitts that my sister and I would put on our hands. We would throw the tennis ball. The tennis ball would stick to it. And I think of oral language as being like that Velcro for that tennis ball, those other pieces of literacy to stick to. So when it comes to second language acquisition, absolutely, second language and multilingual learners need the same elements explicitly, systematically taught to them, but with more of a focus on oral language.
Love it. I think a lot of people in the science of learning, science of reading community can understand that that reading itself is not natural, but that we sort of perhaps have some sort of language instinct that kind of it develops at a certain sensitive period for our first language. And I think the thing that I am still quite not familiar with, not being a second language teacher, is when does some of the more spontaneous learning that happens with your first language and also learning a second language, like how do those interact, and when does one become the other, and so on. Do you have like kind of some of your thoughts and your readings around that big question?
Exactly. That is a big question. That is a heavy question, but I think we need to start off by dispelling myths, because there is this myth that children who are just immersed in a second language or additional language program will magically learn how to read and write in that language as well. That is a myth. The human brain does not learn to decipher code and to translate code into spoken language. We need that explicit instruction of that letter sound correspondence. So if a child is immersed, let's say they're English speaking, they're immersed in French immersion, their brain is wired to learn French and to eventually understand instructions and directions and oral language. But their brain is not wired to know that OI says what, and that EUILLE says œil. That is not in the wiring of their brain until I teach it, that OI says what. But then, to add to their cognitive load, they have to learn that in English it says oi. like oil, foil. But in French, when they see OI, like in the word oiseau, which means bird, that it's not oiseau, it's oiseau. So in terms of the cognitive load required to learn a second language, I think we greatly underestimate how challenging it can be. Now, I do know a number of parents of children with dyslexia in French immersion, and they have made it very clear that they have their child in French immersion knowing full well that their child is going to have 2 sets of code to master in order to learn to read and write in both French and English. So some of those parents have said, my child's in French immersion to learn to understand and speak in French, but they're only going to focus on mastering the English code system or the English phonics system. And I think that is a very fair, as a parent myself, I think that is a very fair expectation, because our children with dyslexia in French immersion are going to struggle mastering that code in English and in French. Furthermore, this is something that we haven't touched on enough in French immersion, is that we also have children with DLD, but we don't necessarily refer to it as DLD, which is developmental language disorder. We have hundreds of kids in French immersion with developmental language disorder or a language impairment. Now that refers to the ability and difficulty to understand spoken language. So that is different, because now we have a child who is going to struggle understanding and speaking both in English and French. That is not their difficulty deciphering and understanding the phonetic code, but it's that spoken language piece. So we do need to make sure that we are providing interventions for our students who also have DLD in second language programs, because sometimes those kids can be overlooked or under-identified. Because they're learning a second language, we think, oh, they're fine, they're just going to learn over time. And then we miss the opportunity to give them interventions.
I had some flashbacks during the video, by the way. So when I studied a year in France, and I came in with like maybe a year's worth. I'm pretty sure it was a year's worth of French in high school before I studied in France. And I'm sitting there and I'm rehearsing what I'm gonna say if I get cold called, right? I'm like planning that out. And very early, I get cold called very first day. And you kept saying écoute during your video, yes. And that means listen, right?
Correct. Well done.
And I said, when the teacher cold called, said, and you, sir, like, can you answer the question, not knowing that I'm not French, right? And I said, je n'écoute pas.
I'm not listening.
Which I'm not listening. And he goes, no kidding. He's like, oh, you n'écoute pas. And he's looking around at everyone. Look at this guy. Wow, not listening. And I had to explain very quickly. Like, I don't understand any of this. Like, I'm sorry.
Well, maybe you needed more explicit systematic instruction because it wasn't happening naturally. So there you go.
And I discovered this in that French year, that all of my peers that were coming from Germany and other countries, we all hoped immersion in France was going to teach us French. And we then split into 2 camps. One that spoke our home language all the time and found out that this just being around French people wasn't enough to learn French.
Exactly.
The other half of us who went home and literally did retrieval practice in our notebooks and like did our own flashcards. It's kind of funny.
Oh, you hit the nail right on the head, right? And I mean, you were there because you wanted to be. You had the initiative and the motivation to learn. But think about all these other kids who are in multilingual programs or second language programs who don't know why the heck they're there. Their parents have put them there because they want them to have more opportunities for employment, more travel opportunities, but they haven't necessarily shared that motivation with their child. So the kid's like, I don't want to be here, madame. I don't want to learn this language. I don't understand what you're talking about. So, it is not as natural or as easy as sometimes we make it out to be.
Yeah, I think it's maybe confusing second language learning with how babies pick up language in their home environment. The idea that we should use the immersion technique that young children receive by just being alive in society, and taking that technique that works really well and trying to apply it to formal learning institutions. I think that's the main problem.
Absolutely. And when I also lived in France for a year, so I'm curious to know where exactly you lived. Maybe we were there at the same time, but I think I'm a lot older than you, so probably not. Probably not.
uh 2006 in Lyon, I was there. So
Okay, so I was there in 1999,
okay.
a few years before you, in the Loire Valley, and I was at the Université de Nantes, and I was there for a full year. And over my Christmas break, I went with a friend who happened to be Italian, and we lived with her Italian family just outside of Venice in Treviso, and she had a 3-year-old cousin, and that was phenomenal because I spoke 3-year-old Italian. I mean, I just was just pointing at words, grappa. I couldn't say, could you please pass the grappa? I could only say words. And so having that toddler, I thought, even though I was in my 20s, I was still speaking the toddler level of language. And so I think we need to remember that regardless of someone's age, if they don't have the foundational skills, we need to go back and teach them those skills regardless of how old they are.
Perfect. Well, I love that. That tied great into your video. We're going to now talk about something that I think a lot of teachers are feeling the frustration of in their districts. I don't think Canada is that much different than the US in this regard. I think we're very much in the same space.
De-
Yeah, what were you going to say about
Depending on the state, I was going to say, this is the day before the election. I think it depends what state you're living in, but yes, I would like to agree. I would like to agree with you. Yes. No comment.
Yeah. I like to do, I think in a recent one, I did like a ranking system with some of the guests. I was like, where are we in terms of Australia and the UK? And I put the US pretty low on the list when it comes to our advancements. But and this is this idea like that teachers are embracing evidence-based approaches. They're learning more through things like letters training, through social media. A lot of teachers have sort of empowered themselves, maybe based off of just listening to a single podcast and then, and taking that and teaching themselves. So, what are some of the strategies educators can use to implement evidence-based approaches in districts that are not at the forefront of this science of learning movement, that are sort of still following a balanced literacy model?
Well, I think it's really important that people understand there are a lot of great free webinars and free workshops available online. One thing that I often recommend to anyone who wants to learn more about the reading research, also known as the science of reading, are podcasts, because teachers are so busy. And in fact, I would say teachers are busier than they've ever been before, but having that background knowledge on how the brain learns to read will help teachers work smarter, not harder. Because sometimes I feel like teachers are spinning their wheels, spinning their wheels, spinning their wheels, and I'm thinking, well, if you did it this way, it would be a lot easier. So podcasts are a wonderful way to increase your understanding and knowledge of the reading research. There are so many fantastic podcasts out there, yours included. Also, there's a lot of wonderful book studies out there too. So I often say to teachers that they can either start a book study or just start reading some books, but there definitely needs to be a shift. And I can only speak for what's happening here in Canada, but there seem to be pockets of people who are aware of the fact that our current approach to reading instruction, known as balanced literacy or whole language, which is the idea that learning to read and write is the same as learning to speak and understand spoken language. That is a theory that has been debunked for decades. So I think it's really important for those pockets of people who know that our current approach isn't working and want to try an approach that does align with the reading research and the way the human brain learns to read, spell, and write, that they find their community of people, because it can be very daunting. It can be very lonely trying to do this learning on your own. So when it comes to what you need to teach, they are the 6 elements of a structured literacy approach: phonemic awareness, phonics, explicitly teaching vocabulary, and those strands under language comprehension, which include background knowledge, vocabulary, syntax and text structures, as well as print awareness. And Scarborough's reading rope is a great framework for anyone who is new to the science of reading and unsure what to teach, but it doesn't necessarily, Scarborough's reading rope doesn't necessarily show you how to teach it. It shows you the elements that have to be taught. But of course, the structured literacy approach isn't just about what you need to teach, but it's about how you need to teach it. So Scarborough's reading rope is a great framework for what you need to teach, but you need to further your learning and understanding of the science of reading to understand the importance of retrieval practice and the science of learning, essentially.
And I think that's the newest missing piece. And I appreciate that there are phases to any sort of journey that a school is on. And maybe the beginning was just saying, hey, we had some things that we were doing that were kind of funky. We are moving to a more science of reading based thing based off of these strands. The issue, of course, is when it sort of ends there, right? When you're just describing the sort of bird's eye view of what reading entails. What a good reader does is they attend to these things, and then you don't ever address at the lesson level where the actual teacher is teaching it and conveying the information. That's where your videos come in, right? That's where you can see like the clarity and the preciseness, the precision of the teacher, so that you can either coach yourself or you're working with a coach and they're coaching you in the classroom. I think that's just so important.
Well, and I think because I am a special education teacher, really I feel like the train stops at me. If the child isn't learning it in the regular classroom, they are referred to me for spec ed support, or we call it SST, student support. And so that learning piece is particularly important in my role, and I feel this massive, would be an understatement, this tremendous weight on my shoulders to ensure the children have learned it. Because if they don't learn it with me, there's nowhere else for them to go. And so it really is making sure that we change the focus from how well we taught it to how well have they learned it. Because if they're not learning it in the regular classroom, yes, I can step in and I can provide a double dose of what's happening in the classroom, that explicit systematic instruction. But we really do have to remember that the learning should be at the center of our teaching.
Yes, I love that. And you in our planning for this episode too, you mentioned some, like, sometimes you're going to get pushback from colleagues or administrators when you're trying these things out, or when you've learned something that you just like, at this point I've read enough that I'm convinced that this is going to work. I need to try it in my class. And you don't get the feedback or the support around that. Tell me, what are maybe some of your tips around that and kind of dealing if you're in that space?
Absolutely. Well, first, I just want to preface this with you don't know what you don't know. And so one of the things I value most in a leader, especially a literacy leader, is someone who says, I'm not familiar with that, but I'm going to look into it. Or I'm not familiar with that. Thank you for sharing it with me. I will investigate the research. So I just want to make sure that our literacy leaders who are saying, I don't know the science of reading, but I'm willing to learn about it, are celebrated, because we need strong leadership. But the reality is we have a lot of leaders in education who were trained and led to believe how reading happens, and that has been debunked. And so I think it's important for our literacy leaders to engage in the learning along with the educators, to provide support and to provide leadership. But until that happens, I advise teachers who are facing pushback to just keep plugging away. And some teachers have reached out to me and said, Kim, this is the approach I'm using, but I'm doing it behind closed doors. Or Kim, I have had to buy decodable books with my own money because my school district is still buying leveled readers. Or Kim, my school wants me to use PM benchmarks, which is in alignment with not the reading research. So PM benchmarks do not align with how or best assessment practices. And so they are using universal screeners behind closed doors, but then having to submit their PM benchmark grades as well. So that is not a good use of teacher time. But I do know that there are a lot of educators who are living in fear of speaking up and saying, this isn't working, because they are fearful for their jobs. They are fearful of being put on probation, even though they have the students' best interests at heart. And I also think it's important for teachers to speak up and to share best practices more vocally and more verbally, because if we don't, at the end of the day, it's harming our students. And we, as teachers, know and have this moral obligation to do what's in the best interest of our students. And so we want to make sure that if we are using the reading research, that we share some of that with our literacy leaders, but we are also doing our best to meet the students' needs, and not just meet them where they're at, but to get them to where they're going, because it's a fact that a lot of students have unnecessarily been put on IEPs and on modified programs, which have made them stuck at where they are. Meet them where they're at, meet them where they're at. So we currently have kids in grade 9 who have been met where they're at, and they're still at grade 1. That is because many teachers have been following system leadership. But we know that an IEP is important, but it isn't just the accommodations. We want to get those kids to the grade level and to reach their maximum potential. And the only way to do that is through explicit systematic structured literacy instruction. An IEP is not going to meet the child's needs. An IEP alone is not the solution. It's the starting point. So I think at the end of the day, teacher knowledge is key, because we have been typically raised to be very compliant, obedient educators in a profession that rewards compliance and obedience. However, we are taught as educators to raise our students, not to raise, I'm thinking about my own kids, to be critical thinkers. But then when we have teachers who are thinking critically about the resources that are being provided to them, their hands are slapped. So there is this mismatch between what we are told and instructed to do as educators. You want to develop critical thinkers. But then when we have teachers who are thinking critically about these level books, and you want me to submit PM benchmarks, well, that takes 25 minutes, and it's a lot faster and more effective to use a universal screener that will tell me exactly what I need to target. But then a lot of these teachers are being faced with consequences for being critical thinkers. So I think we really need to celebrate the teachers who are using a science-based approach, and to help our literacy leaders feel comfortable saying, I don't know, but I will look into it further and be learners along with us. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, but there was a lot of pieces to that.
And it gets me thinking about a lot of things. It's like, personally, I had the privilege, I think, of being outspoken for a few different reasons. It was like when I was younger in the first 3 years, I feel like it was just so easy to silence younger teachers. I would not do that if I was a leader. I would actually listen to some of these teachers. Some of them are coming out of pretty good programs. There's not a lot of them out there, but some of them have actually had science of reading in their teaching programs. And actually the leaders are the ones that are behind the science. And so to just ignore them, or and I think the opposite is true too, where you have these experienced teachers who've seen the pendulum go back and forth, and at the end of the day, they go into their classroom, they stand at the front, and they get lots of responses and opportunities to respond. They get lots of practice, and they're doing the thing, and then they're pushed to the side simply for being older or subtle ageism there. I just think leadership, you're right, is kind of the key to all this.
Absolutely. And I think we need to redefine what effective leaders look like. And I think I can say this, but my husband and I have very different ideas of what a leader should look like. I believe a leader should be someone who doesn't have all the answers, but says, that's okay. I will find them, and I will support you as you try to find them too. But we also have to remember that our leaders are expected to know more than we do sometimes, because if our leaders are simply just coaches, then we could be coaching the wrong way of doing things. It's like a mentorship program. A mentor should, especially when it comes to reading instruction, a mentor hopefully is not going to mentor you in practices that don't align with the reading research. We need to make sure that our mentors and our tutors and our leaders are knowledgeable. Otherwise, we're just going to perpetuate the cycle of ineffective instruction.
And I think, because I've stood up in front of everyone and I tried to convince everyone in my 5 minutes of fame, standing in front of everyone and hoping to explain everything to everyone, and it didn't go anywhere. I often encourage teachers to think like, if you are in that moment where you need to speak up, you are not going to convince the person who's running the meeting right then and there that 100% of your ideas at that moment, but you could get someone that's in the room who is ready to hear that message, and then they feel emboldened now to speak up in the next meeting. I just think sometimes you have to you have to be patient with this stuff too. Your bravery is not going to lead to like overnight change, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, and I think also there's a lot of credibility in education. I'm speaking strictly for education, a lot of credibility for people who have walked the talk, because there are a lot of literacy instructors and literacy leaders who have been out of the classroom for so long. They're telling us what to do and not showing us that how piece because they haven't implemented it, or it has changed in the last couple of decades since they were in the classrooms themselves. And so I think that leadership piece is a big piece of the puzzle, but there are many different pieces of the puzzle to ensure that our students are getting what they need. It can't just come down on the shoulders of teachers, and a lot of teachers feel the weight on their shoulders to teach these kids how to read and are not necessarily getting the support from their district that they need.
And,
And
right.
they're burning out.
And they're burning out. Like, I hear people say like teachers should like become readers of research and should read the research directly. And I just want to say, hold on a second. Like, I I did the PhD thing. It took me 3 or 4 years to learn how to do that, of intensive instruction on how to read a research paper and to
Yes.
gain enough methodological awareness and to understand like kind of the general layout and what's a good study and a weak study. That was a lot of teaching to put on the shoulders of teachers to become researchers or action researchers or whatever else. I just think it's not realistic. The leaders need to become more research informed.
You nailed it. That's what I was going to say. We need strong leadership who are staying current on the reading research so they can disseminate that information. Otherwise, teachers are essentially doing double duty. They are implementing it and trying to learn the reading research at the same time. And we have literacy coaches, we have literacy consultants, we have superintendents of literacy. And as you move further up the ladder and the hierarchy in education, sometimes the more disconnected you become from what is needed in the classroom. And so I think we really need to do our best to support leaders and to celebrate the leaders who are engaging the reading research and disseminating the reading research to those who need it the most, which are our classroom teachers.
Excellent. I mean, and Scott Hill, by the way, of Evergreen School District, was on this
Yes.
podcast, and these are the people I'm trying to bring on. It's like the folks that are leading the way despite like kind of maybe the initial popularity of their decisions, and now finally they are catching a bit of wind in their sails and they're starting to see learning gains. I just think it's so
Absolutely.
so important.
And as well as Jack De Silva in Bethlehem, and as well as I want to give a shout out to Angie Hanlon. Angie Hanlon is, in my mind, a literacy champion because as first a principal and now superintendent, she is in there doing the universal screeners, supporting teachers, helping them collect the data. And she is as knowledgeable as the teacher. She's not just telling them what to do, she's showing them how to do it. And it's that piece that we need in our literacy leaders. Don't just tell me what to do, show me how to do it.
Well, I mean, let's go on to our final question, Kim. This is fascinating, and I love your passion. I wish we need to work on something in the future. Is all I'm just trying to plant that seed. Our last question: how can teachers effectively engage and support parents and caregivers in their children's literacy development, especially when introducing new instructional methods?
So I think this is really important. In fact, this is what I focused my research on when I did my master's in education. I focused my research on how to support parents of children who struggle to read and write when they don't speak the language of instruction at home. So not just in the context of French immersion, where they don't speak French at home and the majority of parents don't speak French at home, but so many parents want to help their child but don't speak the language of instruction at home. So I often say if we want our children to be bilingual and biliterate, which means the ability to read and write in a second language, then we want the parents and the caregivers to focus on their home language. And that is lots of reading aloud, because when we read aloud, it doesn't teach children to decode the words themselves. So I just want to make that very clear. Reading a book aloud or reading a text aloud to a child is not going to somehow through osmosis or magically teach them to decode that text. But what it will do is it will build that bank of receptive vocabulary words. It will build their mental dictionary of vocabulary so they have more words in their lexicon so that they can attach meaning to words they hear and then hopefully eventually read. We also want parents and caregivers to model what fluent reading looks like, and that is reading at a pace that is comfortable, like the way we speak, but with accuracy and with some expression too, because we want to make sure that children understand that the purpose of reading is to extract meaning from text. And the best way to do that is to read fluently. But we also want to dispel the myths for families. We want to make sure that families understand, even though they are reading aloud every single night, that does not make for a good decoder. And so dispelling myths is an important piece of that parent education, but it's also important for the classroom teachers they're going to have to do double duty to make sure that they are teaching the phonetic code in the second language, because that is not something that the parents can do themselves. And without the reading piece, with the text piece, having parents work on sound skills, which is piece of the phonological and phonemic awareness, which is developing students' awareness that spoken language can be manipulated. And so I have done a lot of choice boards, a lot of activities for parents of my second language learners and multilingual learners to practice at home in their home language, because phonemic awareness skills are cross-linguistic. If parents are working on sound skills at home in their home language, maybe it's Arabic, maybe it's Spanish, maybe it's Italian, those skills will help them in French. For example, if they are going for a walk to the mailbox and they say, what's the first sound you hear in the word mail? And the child can identify or if they are walking down by the waterfront and they see a boat and they say, look there's a boat. What's the first sound in boat? It's B. Well, then when they come to French immersion the next day, I can say, voici le mot bateau, which means boat in French. Le premier sound, the first sound, c'est B. So whether the vocabulary word is boat or bateau, the first sound is B. And so that sound skill awareness and proficiency is one of the best things that a family can do to help support their children's second language acquisition, but also their acquisition of learning their first language as well.
I love that. And one of the big debates online, and it shouldn't even be a debate, it doesn't make any sense to me, but it's this idea of should parents teach their child to read? And of course that means two different things, right? You've just described, you could say teaching a child to read involves all of these pre-reading skills around playing with words, manipulating sounds, and reading aloud to them, but stop short of delivering an explicit phonics sequence with a curriculum resource, right? And then there's these other folks who are like, it's my job to teach them to read, and I kind of feel like they then absolve they excuse the school from the responsibility of teaching everybody to read. So for me, this kind of tracks with what I think is reasonable to expect of parents.
It is and it isn't. And I'll be honest, I am very aware of everything I'm saying because we cannot make the assumption that the parents can read in the second language or even their home language. And what I'm seeing in my school is this cycle of students who are coming through the system that we previously failed. And now we're sending them home newsletters and we're sending them contracts. My daughter had to have her HPV shot the other day. There was a lot of reading for me to do. So we are not always, as a system, and I'm going to say this broadly across Ontario, not ensuring that our graduates are proficient in reading, and then 4 years later they have a baby and we ask them to read aloud to their child. If we failed them as a student in the system here in Ontario, and they go on to have children themselves, it is not fair for us to ask them to read to their child at home. And I would argue that it's not fair for us to assume they can read a lot of the emails, newsletters, and correspondence that we assume they have. So we have to break that cycle. And I think now whether or not you can read the text and have that letter sound correspondence, but pretty much all of our parent community can say words aloud, and they can hopefully identify the first sound in a word, the ending sound. But if we failed them in that area, again, it's not fair for us to ask parents who are products of the system to do things that we actually never taught them to do themselves.
And it's sort of like, yeah, I think what you're going to get from a lot of schools, like my daughter goes to a school here that's in a pretty privileged neighborhood. So you have two parent households, you have highly educated parents, right?
Yep.
And so to send that a simple email and say, hey, read every night, play
Yes.
around with these sounds, sure, that's going to work fine, right? But what about the kid that's got sorted into this class that his parents are in the close enough but are not in there? They're not going to get that at home. The teacher has to teach them. The teacher has to be the in between, I think.
Exactly. And you also raised a very good point about where your children go to school. Being educated and employed. Well, first of all, being literate myself, which led me to decent employment, which has led me to a very comfortable way of living. My daughters also went to quite a typical middle-class school. And I was looking at standardized assessments, and the school does really, really well. So I thought, yes, I want my children to go to a school that is academically focused. But we have to be careful. And Emily Hanford mentions this in her podcast. Affluent communities don't necessarily mean the schooling and the level of instruction is any different than it is elsewhere. Often, those are the families who have access to private services. And so are the state reading assessments high because this instruction is different in the school? Often not. Often it's because those families have financial resources to access private supports. So I think it's really important for your audience to understand that affluent neighborhoods, yes, everybody wants their child to go to a school that's in an affluent neighborhood with educated parents, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the literacy instruction is any different than it is in the more impoverished, marginalized communities. The only difference is the kids living in the impoverished communities don't have access to private Orton Gillingham tutors.
Yeah, and I can refer to another episode on this show too that sort of proves this point. Is there's an episode with a school called Morningside Academy, which I want people to check out. But basically, they are a for tuition, a pretty expensive private school, but they draw all the kids out of private schools in Seattle that essentially their schools are not teaching them phonics, and they teach them
Right.
foundational skills for the private schools, for the private affluent families of Seattle. They're all sending them there because they know that they'll get explicit instruction there.
And they don't have to pay out of pocket.
Yeah.
I know. I'm seeing a lot of that, especially on West Coast Canada right now, in Vancouver, in West Vancouver, in the North Shore, extremely affluent. But the public schools are using, some of the public schools, not all of them, are using a more research-based approach, whereas the private schools are pretty entrenched in tradition and using a whole language approach.
It's crazy.
We don't necessarily want to perpetuate the private sector. I'm a public school teacher, and I want to bring, the private Orton Gillingham tutor magic into my classroom in the public sector so that we don't perpetuate those inequities.
Well, I loved our discussion today, Kim, and I think this is the time where you could tell our audience kind of where they can contact you or where they can find your stuff before we close out.
Sure. I mean, I am active on social media. On Facebook, I do have a group. I actually don't always remember the name of it. So as we talk, I'm just going to quickly look it up. I do have a group for educators and parents. It's called Resources and Support for Educators and Families of FSL, which stands for French Second Language Students. But I'm not just posting things that are specific to French immersion, because what's essential for some is good for all. So what I'm doing in French immersion is equally important for our English language and our other classrooms as well. And on Instagram, I am Madame Lockhart, capital L, capital S, capital B, which is like Learning Disability Student Body. And then on Twitter, I am at MMELOCKHART So that is at Madame Lockhart, capital L, capital D, capital S, capital B, LDSB. And I do post regularly. My own two daughters are in middle school and high school right now, so I have a particular interest in what's happening in literacy in the older grades, because if we're not teaching kids how to decode in elementary, naturally they're going into secondary school not able to decode. And how is that affecting their math? How's that affecting their science, history, and how's that affecting the graduation rate? So really, I've been posting a lot now on how to close the learning achievement gaps in the upper grades.
Perfect. Kim, it's so great to have you on the show. I'm sure our listeners got a kick out of it. Listeners, thank you for tuning in again to Progressively Incorrect. I'll keep on releasing episodes every week. It's just been such a great show, and I'm so glad that you joined us. Thank you, Kim Lockhart.
Thank you so very much, and thank you for doing everything you're doing to support educators, not just across America, but across Canada too.
Perfect.
Take
care, Kim.
Thank you.